Today we inaugurate a series of lectures on the relations between journalism and literature. Although numerous writers, from Mark Twain to Ernest Hemingway, Zola to Camus, from Rubén Darío to Gabriel García Márquez, from Joan Maragall to Josep Pla, from Dino Buzzati to Oriana Fallaci, and so many others, have practiced journalism, humanities departments have been remiss to study the journalistic side of these and other authors. And rarely are seminars in journalism offered in literature departments, even though these departments can no longer afford to pander to solely canonical works. The days are long gone when literature departments could afford to prescribe Marcel Proust's recipe for commerce with 3 or 4 masterworks only during the whole lifetime. Proust pitted a highly exclusive selection of great canonical works against journalism when he said that journalism forces us to take an interest in some fresh triviality or other every day. Of course, if one flushed out the everyday and the triviality from his magnus opus, there would be little left except for maybe Bergsonian skeleton, and I guess that one could say that James Joyce was closer to the truth when he reversed Proust's judgment and claimed that literature deals with the ordinary. The unusual and extraordinary belong to journalism. Now, perhaps this is true, since one commonplace about journalism is that it feeds on news, whether found or fabricated, and news depends on novelty. But the ability to capture the unexpected is not journalism's only or unique source of interest. Journalism, during the print era, was also a school of writing, and possibly a school of good writing. At its best, it erased the borderline between itself and the more exalted kind of writing that we call literary. It is then incomprehensible that decades after the debates of high and low, when so many media extraneous to writing have conquered a place in the cultural studies programs, journalism still remains a stranger to literary studies departments. Now, as a contribution to remedy this situation, we have programmed a series of talks with a view to starting a dialogue between experts in communication and in literary analysis, between professional journalists and literary critics, in order to better understand the political and the institutional conditions that regulate or modify what is produced under the pressure of the timeline, and how and when such productions rise to meet the stringent criteria of great writing. Now, among those who have reflected on the relations between these institutionally divergent, but in practice not incompatible modes of writing, is Albert Chillón of the Universitat Autónoma de Barcelona. We are very pleased that he will deliver the inaugural talk of the series. And next, my co-organizer, Cuauhtémoc García will do the honors and introduce Professor Chillón.
Thank you very much. It is a pleasure for me to introduce the first speaker of our series, Professor Albert Chillón. Albert Chillón is a Spanish researcher and writer specialized in the relationship between literature, journalism, and the media. He is the author of Literatura y Periodismo, una tradición de relaciones promiscuas, 1999-2012, a classical monography in this field, among several books and studies around this broad subject. He has written and recently published the novel El Horizonte Ayer, 2012, and is director of the Master in Communication and Journalism of the Universitat Autónoma de Barcelona. Since 1995, as well, he has devoted his research to the anthropology of communication and written La Condición Ambigua, 2011, and Un Ser de Mediaciones, Antropología de la Comunicación, volumen 1, 2012, in collaboration with Luis Doc. Chillón is currently director of the Department of Media, Comunicación and Cultura de la Universidad Autónoma de Barcelona, and a veteran promoter of the humanistic perspective in the study and practice of the media. So, without further delay, I give the floor to Professor Chillón, please.
Let's speak in English, Catalan, Espanol, as you want, as you prefer.
Aleshores pots fer el que vulguis. Hem tallat la gravació. Si la vols fer formalment, et tornem a connectar.
A veure, és que depèn del que fem. Si hem de xerrar una conversa, clar.
Que tu, com te sentis més còmode, tu ets el que decideixes.
És una pregunta, jo m'he preparat tant per fer-ho en anglès, que no és la meva llengua, però ho tinc molt estructurat en anglès.
Vols fer-ho en anglès?
Ja, però és que llavors una mica ridícul, jo us parli a vosaltres durant 50 minuts.
Quan tu decideixes?
Com vols.
Bueno, potser és que si ho faig en anglès, és a dir, com que... A mi
podem
m'agrada parlar
preparar.
de diu sempre, però com que jo no domino l'anglès com vosaltres, ho he preparat tot escrit.
Vols llegir-la?
I revisar.
Cap problema, de veritat.
Que t'estiguis bé.
Vinga, doncs.
Voy a editar.
Connects? Sí. Està connectat?
Sí, sí.
Ah, això
sí, sí,
és.
cap problema.
Vale, espera, deixa'm que... És que saps què passa, que jo crec que ho faré més fi, no? Sí, quasi millor llegit, és que si no, faré una tertúlia i perdrà matisos. No?
Sí.
Em disculpeu l'anglès, que no és el vostre. Sabeu que jo l'anglès el parlo quan surto de vacances, vull dir. Clar. Well, let's begin. Thank you very much for your kind invitation. Joan Carles Alsina, Cuauhtémoc Garcia, and Roger Casas. I've prepared a presentation about a subject for which I feel a big passion. It's called Between Faction and Fiction, the Promiscuous Relations between Literature and Journalism in the Postmodern Time. I will first apologize because my English is not the English I like to speak, and I hope you will understand my eventual mistakes. But I will read the text in order to do it better and to express the nuances of my thought about the subject. One of the hallmarks of our time, named postmodern by Jean-François Lyotard at the late 70s, is the proliferation of forms of writing, aesthetically and epistemologically ambiguous, distinguished by the hybridization of genres and styles, and especially for the blurring of boundaries between the true and the false, between document and fabulation, between the verifiable and the invented. I described this phenomenon in 1999 when I published the first edition of my book Literatura y Periodismo, una tradición de relaciones promiscuas. And today I must confirm it with even more reason when the journalistic literary trends that I studied 14 years ago have significantly extended its borders, its frontiers, towards other cultural areas, or have found their counterpart in them according with the spirit of the time. Do you understand my poor English? Observable from the 60s to the last century, the intensification of the everlasting promiscuity between literature and journalism is, without any doubt, one of the main manifestations of this broad trend I try to describe. I am thinking, for example, in the famous new journalism by Truman Capote, Tom Wolfe, or Gay Talese in the 70s and the 60s. I am thinking too in the almost correlative new journalistic trends in Europe and Latin America, represented by authors like Ryszard Kapuscinski, Oriana Fallaci, Gunther Wallraff, Manuel Vázquez Montalbán, or Gabriel García Márquez, or I think also in the latest journalistic literary currents that have inherited this tradition, whose exponents include today, for example, John Lee Anderson in the United States, or Emmanuel Carrère in France, or Leila Guerriero in Argentina, not to mention the so-called new journalism by Robert Boynton. Today we can observe, however, that these promiscuous relationships between literature and journalism I have just mentioned before do not happen only among these cultural fields, but also among other fields affected by the same or similar trend of mixture. I am referring to the documentary literature and the factographic prose by authors like John Berger, Miguel Barnett, Bruno Bettelheim, Javier Cercas, or Peter Weiss, or to the cinematographic and televisive narratives which so often flirt with the mixtures of genres and styles in hybrid forms as docudrama, infotainment, reality shows, or fiction, so-called fiction based on true events. I also refer finally to some of the new and not so new streams of comic and graphic novel, a phenomenon very interesting, in my opinion, whose authors, like, for example, Joe Sacco, or in Spain, Carlos Jimenez, or Marjane Satrapi in Iran, or Chester Brown in the States, they claim to reporting concrete facts, or at least general circumstances actually existent. Sorry. I must add, however, that postmodernism has not only distinguished itself by the hybridization of genres and styles, but also by the notorious growth of the theoretical consciousness about this phenomenon, and likewise, last but not least, about the confused border areas that always, and not only in our time, have overlapped what I like to call the factitious diction and the fictitious diction. I will explain afterwards why I talk about factitious diction and I don't use the label non-fiction. This new awareness, typically postmodern, forms, in my opinion, an essential dimension of the subject now I am trying to explore, because much of the most insightful contemporary thought, let's say philosophy of language or hermeneutics or semiotics or the so-called new rhetoric, has allowed us to realize that all the genres of discourse, whatever their epistemic goals may be, are without exception affected by at least three decisive mediations. First, their common linguistic condition. Second, their common rhetoric condition. And third, their narrative condition, which affects many of them, although it is not as universal as the two I have mentioned before. I will refer to all of these mediations in a few minutes, but before that, nevertheless, I will say that the extension of this theoretical postmodern consciousness is not at all alien to the hybridizations between fiction and faction that I am trying to clarify in this presentation. Let's consider, by way of illustration, for example, the following cases selected from different fields. In the field, for example, of the audiovisual documentary, Andrew Jarecki, an American director, offers in Capturing the Friedmans a double inquiry. First of all, about the ambiguous and almost inscrutable background of the family Friedman, and beyond it, most of all, a deep reflection about inaccuracies, ambiguities, and gaps that every narrative implies always. As the narrative leaves behind the verisimilitude in search of the so-called truth. For me, this is the main subject of the film. For his part, for example, French director Claude Lanzmann offers in his masterpiece Shoah, his overwhelming documentary on Nazi extermination camps, a deep reflection on the limits and possibilities that affect both the iconic image as the oral and written narrative when they deal with the representation of reality. For example, in another field related to this, in the literary journalistic field, some great authors propose a meditation about the always problematic narrative representation of actual events and situations that actually happened, besides offering the reader documentary novels of impeccable journalistic and aesthetic quality. Let's take, for example, in the work of James Agee in the masterpiece Let Us Now Praise Famous Men, of John Hersey in Hiroshima, and of Truman Capote in Cold Blood. In another field, a neighbor field, that is social science, for example, in sociology, anthropology, psychology, or historiography, we must stress the importance of the so-called factographies, or factographic writing, which usually document with a commendable blend of scientific accuracy and humanist sensitivity their case studies. I mean, for example, those by Oliver Sacks, Awakenings, Oscar Ruiz, The Sons of Sanchez, or Ronald Fraser, Blood of Spain, an oral history of the Spanish Civil War. This type of hybrid narratives question the positivism and the quantified pandemic or pandemics that today afflicts social sciences and of course the whole field of humanities. And they do it by cultivating the so-called qualitative methods. Careful and often participant observation, for example, life exploration, orality, testimony, and ultimately the vindication of the narration as a privileged way of knowledge. And for talking about another field in which we can also explore this mixture, I would like to stress the presence of the most prominent exponents of the so-called self-fiction in the shadow of Marcel Proust and of other great precedents, authors like Philip Roth in the States, Javier Marias in Spain, John Coetzee in South Africa, or Enrique Villamatas in Catalonia, Paul Auster or the German Winfried Sebald write novelistic inquiries about their own actual experience, which are at the same time inventive creations about the experience of every one of their readers. All the works I have just mentioned illustrate eloquently, in my opinion, some of the most important creative trends that postmodernism encourages. The postmodern relativism, as is well known, has encouraged the relaxation of morals, the relaxation of the principles and regulations, has encouraged also irony and desacralization, and therefore the hybridization of genres and styles, and also has encouraged the intentional and unintentional alloy mixture of fiction and faction. And finally, he has promoted the frequent transfers and mixtures between different cultural levels, high, medium, and low, as MacDonald wrote decades ago, once separated by rigid boundaries in the time of, for example, Spengler or Ortega y Gasset. At the same time, this ethical, aesthetical, and epistemological relativism has extended the awareness about the often blurry, promiscuous relations that exist between fiction and faction in any historical period, not only in postmodernity, and very specifically in our time. Today we know that the triple mediation I mentioned before, linguistic, rhetorical, and narrative, always affects all the genres of discourse, and therefore its fictitious and factitious dimensions. Since this is a fundamental issue, let me open a parenthesis of a few minutes to address it before continuing our exploration of the links between fiction and faction in our times. I will make a short theoretical parenthesis that I think it's very necessary to clarify the question. The first of these three mediations I have mentioned is verbal language itself, according to the philosophy of language of Humboldt and Nietzsche, whose contemporary corollary is the linguistic term cultivated by authors like Ludwig Wittgenstein, Hans-Georg Gadamer, Edward Sapir, Benjamin Lee Whorf, José María Valverde in Spain, the great Valverde, I want to mention him, John Searle and George Steiner, among others. According to the linguistic term, language is not just, as we used to think, just a vehicle or instrument of simple transmission of information, supposedly able to translate the ideas previously forged by the mind, but language is a sine qua non condition of thought itself, at least in its rational aspect. What Gadamer called linguisticity imposes its possibilities and limitations to any form of speech and forces us to distinguish qualitatively between things and events, on the one hand, and the words that try to represent them on the other hand. This means also that linguisticity allows us to impose some kind of order in what originally was disordered, a configuration that makes sense and allows human beings to articulate their thought. Regarding the question we are addressing now, it should be added that linguistic awareness necessarily compels us to reconsider on different premises two conceptual dichotomies very deeply rooted in the common sense. The first dichotomy, refuted by the linguistic awareness, that I will only mention summarily, is the usual distinction between speech and reality. This dichotomy imagines human reality as if it was no more than natural reality. It is as if human reality was not also made of statements, besides matter, besides the what physics called matter. Reality, in reality, is made also by speech acts that can transform performatively the given realities, as John Austin and John Searle have very convincingly argued. The second dichotomy I want to refute, very popular, nevertheless, distinguish between fiction and non-fiction. And imagine that there are fictitious statements that mainly obey the imagination on the one hand, and non-fictional statements supposedly capable to refer reality in a reproductive, objective, and non-mediated manner on the other. The numerous advocates of this unfounded dichotomy tend to forget that what really exists, in fact, are dictions that combine very diverse forms of fiction and faction, and therefore the fictitious and the factitious. And they also tend to forget, therefore, that the factitious statements that they call non-fictional are characterized because they are not reproductions but representations or mimesis of reality itself. This is what happens, for example, in the novel-like report The Right Stuff, written by Tom Wolfe in the 70s about the American special program. Or it happens in the subjective documentary, formidable documentary, The Cleaners and the Female Cleaner, by the French director Agnès Varda, or in the poetic documentary Man on Wire by Mike Marsh. All of them are great examples of these deliberately ambiguous narratives that mix fiction and faction, and that integrate the vast continent of what George Steiner calls post-fiction. It can be said with propriety, in short, that postmodern thought has noticed something that is not only typical of our time, but of any historical period. Postmodern thought has discovered that there is not a radical and qualitative difference between fictitious and factitious statements. That is, between statements based on the free invention of what could possibly happen on the one hand, and statements based on the accurate documentation of what actually happened on the other hand, or between poetry and history, to use the terms employed by Aristotle in his Poetics. What actually exists, in fact, are differences of degree and manner between multiple variants of diction, in an arc that goes from the freest fiction to the more disciplined, we could say, disciplined faction, since all of them are affected by their common linguistic condition. The second mediation that the postmodern consciousness stresses is not only linguistic but rhetorical, since any speech act, also the most deliberately truthful, is a metaphorization, it's a difficult word, metaphorization, of the things and events referred. A qualitative leap between the order of things and events on one side and what we say about what they are and how they are on the other. From the decisive investigations on rhetoric by thinkers like Gerber in Germany or Nietzsche in the 19th century, to the more recent contributions by Paul de Man Stephen Tolmin, Kenneth Burke, Paul Ricoeur, or George Lakoff, one of the main tributaries of the aforementioned linguistic term teaches us that the real, always unknown and elusive, is built as human reality through the power of metaphors. That is, the power of metamorphosis. Inherent in the language itself, thinking is essentially speaking, I have said that before, indeed, but we must add immediately that talking and thinking then is an essential rhetoric activity. Undoubtedly, the queen of figures of speech, metaphors make possibles, the decisive translation whereby raw events are converted to images, words, and concepts, that is, virtual allusions of very different semiotic nature. The discipline that the ancients called rhetoric has suffered an unexpected and fundamental reassessment in recent decades, and this despite the fact that, still in the middle of last century, rhetoric seemed overtaken by the developments of linguistic semiotics and literary theory. Along with the aforementioned Kenneth Burke or Stephen Tolmin, the main thinker responsible of this rehabilitation of rhetoric was undoubtedly Charles Perelman, fruitful inheritor of the legacy of Aristotle rhetoric. But other prominent philosophers and linguists of our time who have drawn attention to the vital role that metaphors and tropes play have also been responsible of this rehabilitation. Today, we know that any speech act is rhetorical, from the novel and the poem to the tweet or the newspaper headline. And of course, are rhetorical as well, for better or worse, each and every one of the words that integrate both fiction and faction, whose promiscuous relations we are exploring. The third of these mediations, clarified by postmodern linguistic awareness, is of narrative character, since all speech acts that refer to the personal and collective experience involve some form of, we could say, myth and narration. As these speech acts must represent the temporal, the spatial, and the casual dimensions of experience. They must explain time, space, and causation. According to the magnificent disquisition that French philosopher Paul Ricoeur proposes about that question in his classic Time and Narration, the narrative is the essential canvas, often unnoticed, for all modes of discourse that are designed to represent the life course of events, for all modes of discourse that are designed to represent the life in its qualitative way of producing, whether unintentionally truthful or fabulated, whether explicitly narrative, as for example the epic story of the novel, or implicitly narrative, as the historiographic discourse, the persuasive argumentation in newspapers, or the journalistic explanation. In the manner of a textile composed of a visible weft and an invisible warp, is the textual weft, the mythos, in Ricoeur's words, which makes possible what he calls the concordance of the discordant. First, the weft makes possible the identification of certain events and experiences between the canvas that includes a life span. And then, especially the weft, makes possible its association with each other in accordance with such configuration schemes that the different types of weft offer us. What actually happens is not that the story, as is commonly believed, is confined to the realm of fiction, invention, or simple entertainment. What actually happens is that story constitutes the visible or invisible canvas of the forms of discourse seemingly objective and reproductive, all of them necessarily constrained by the limits and the possibilities imposed by the narrativity for expressing recurse terms. Let's think, for example, in historiography, in the literature of the self, in documentary narrative, in memoirs, biographies, or simply in journalism. In the next minutes, I will try, first of all, to clarify what I mean by the two concepts I have just proposed, faction and factitious, and I'll try to clarify as well which are the links between these notions that those of fiction and fictional commonly accept and use. This brief theoretical disquisition, in every way necessary, in my opinion, will pave the way to explore with enough detail the different modes of speech, from the freest fabulation that fiction allows to verifiable and disciplined faction. Such a reformulation of orthodox dichotomy between fiction and non-fiction will allows us to explore different expressions of contemporary fiction and faction. And also, we will be able to notice how George Steiner was right when in Language and Silence warned us that post-fiction is one of the most characteristic features of postmodern culture, at least since the 60s until today. Can I stop? Minutes? Oof, sorry about my English. No. Jo és que trobo que pronuncio molt malament, em sap molt de greu perquè jo intento parlar català